We may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. Christian Ferguson was 9 years old when he was killed in 2003. And for 19 years, that man right there, Dawan Ferguson, has gotten away with it. It is time that he be held responsible. It is time that Christian Ferguson and his family finally receive justice. So let's start back at the beginning. And let's go through all of the evidence that you've heard in this case. It all began and it all changed on January 16th of 2001. And that is when Christian Ferguson had that traumatic injury occur to him, where he slipped into a coma, suffered severe brain damage, and his life changed forever. He could no longer walk. He could no longer talk. He had to have a feeding tube inserted. Everything changed then. And I submit to you, that is when this all began. That is an action taken by the defendant. You heard from Dr. Grange. She told you that the defendant said that Christian was not feeling well the night before. He didn't call. He didn't take him into the hospital then. He put him in bed, and according to the defendant's own words, checked on him at 11:15 and found him non-responsive. However, you also heard from Sharon Williams, and she told you that the defendant called her that day around 8:30 or 9, and that Christian was having problems then. And he said he was waiting on Dr. Grange because she went to the hospital and she waited for hours. So right there, we already have an inconsistent story by the defendant. And we have a period of several hours where we don't know what he was doing with Christian, but we know he wasn't taking him to the hospital. But even if you believe the defendant's version of that story, it is just as bad. He is trained to look out for the symptoms of a hyperammonemic state. He ignored those symptoms, put his child in bed, and didn't check on him until 11 o'clock the next day. Because of all of that, Christian was in the hospital for the next 6 months, and he would never again be the cute little boy that you saw on that video. That is an action by the defendant. He knew what he was doing then. And Christian's story from that point forward just gets even sadder and sadder. The suffering that this little boy had to endure is tragic, and it is because of him. He was his father. He was the one that was supposed to take care of him, and he didn't. No one wants to believe that a person could be capable of doing something like this, much less a parent. And that explains partially why he got away with it for so long. But you heard from Dr. Grange, if Christian was being seen by nurses for about 40 hours a week, receiving his food and nutrition during that time period, it would be enough for him to limp along. Wouldn't necessarily result in hospitalizations, but it would account for why Christian was not developing or growing. So let's talk about that time period when Christian, thank God, had at least some nurses there. You heard from Trudell Day. She was quite emotional on the stand. She described what she saw in that household in 2002. She would pick up little Christian at the start of her shift. He would be in double-wrapped diapers, urine-soaked all the way through his clothing, where it would drip down and puddle up in his shoes? That's horrible. And you know what? We have the photographs that corroborate what she is saying. Look at Christian's clothing there. You heard from FBI agent Liza Ludovico? That's all biological material, urine, soaked through his clothes all the way down his pant leg, even on his shirt. You heard from Liza Ludovico about the double diapers that she found, saturated with urine, and no fecal matter in there. The only thing she found in there was digested bits of diaper. And she told you that would suggest that he wasn't eating anything because the only thing that was passing through his body was a diaper. Tridell Day told you about how she would watch the medications, and it would be the same from when she would leave on Friday to when she would get back Monday morning. She would find him in the same clothing she left the night before, the same diaper she left before. She had to buy him food. She had to let him use her own son's clothing because it wasn't being provided or it wasn't cleaned by the defendant. All of this goes to show the neglect that Dawan Ferguson had for his own son. March 2003 marks a big point in Christian's life, and in this case. In the first half of the charge period, at least Christian was still being seen by people. But from March of 2003 until June of 2003, no one saw Christian. No doctors saw Christian. No nurses were seeing Christian. His own mother wasn't seeing Christian. And that is the part that is the most alarming here. You heard from Lynn Ferguson. You heard from DeShonda Linwood, who talked about what was going on during that time period. Christian was getting skinnier and skinnier. But when Christian went to that last doctor's appointment on March of 2003, he had dropped 7 pounds from his previous checkup 2 years before. Think about that. A 7 to 8 to 9-year-old child, not growing at all in height, and losing weight. Think about how much a 7, an 8, and 9-year-old grow. That caused them concern. Should the nurses and should the doctors have hotlined this? Yes. Did they? No. But that does not mean that he has not been proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. It just makes the story even more tragic. Because everybody, in a way, failed here. But the hospital sent letters trying to get him to come in for checkups. They made phone calls, and they all went unanswered. You heard about Theta's last visit with Christian on March 22nd. She had concerns then about his appearance. She brought him to the hospital. And she said goodbye. And that was the last time she ever saw her son. At that point, the nurses were gone. There was no one in the home to care for Christian other than himself. The defendant didn't bother to do a thing. That's when the medications stopped being picked up. That's when the food and nourishment stopped being ordered. There was no one to do it now. It was all his responsibility. And he didn't do it. You heard. They would shut him in his room, tie him to a bed, and forget about him. He and Monica lived in the basement. You saw the basement. That's where everything was. You saw the upstairs. The living room had nothing in it. There was a formal dining room table that the kids weren't allowed to use. Christian was confined to his bedroom, tied to a bed by his father. There was evidence that they would tie him up, turn out all the lights, and leave him there while they would go to dinner. Who does something like that? What this child had to endure is horrible. He already had so many struggles in his life given his condition. And he was an inconvenience. And every act that the defendant did during that time period is a deliberate act. It goes to the deliberation for the murder charge. Every time he didn't give him his medicine, every time he didn't feed him, that was an act that was killing him. And finally, in June 9th of 2001, time's up. He couldn't get away with keeping Christian from anyone any longer. Theda filed a motion in court, and it was set to go before a judge. You heard from Sharon Williams, who talks about the end of May around Memorial Day. The defendant came to her upset. Tell Theda to drop this. Why do we have to go back to court? Can't she just wait until the kids are older? And then he said, Theda will get those kids over my dead body. He did not want to have to show Christian to anyone because he knew he was going to get caught. Based on his actions, it could be inferred he was hoping Christian would die naturally, and it just hadn't happened yet. So we go to that June 9th court hearing, and you heard from Mary Ellen Pennick, who observed the defendant when that order was read. He was upset. He was angry. He looked frustrated. Because now he had to figure out what to do. And that takes us to the night of June 10th, the early morning hours of June 11th. You heard from Lynn Ferguson. She remembers seeing Christian's G button not in his stomach that day. She told Monica, said she was aware, didn't care. You heard from Monica. Doesn't sound like she cares about anything. And then that night, Christian's moaning, groaning. If you remember from that video from the Child Advocacy Center, Connor demonstrated what Christian's eyes looked like. They were rolling in the back of his head, eyes fluttering. According to Dr. Grange, that would mean that Christian was entering into one of those hyperammonemic states, or was in one already, and would not be able to survive for 24 hours. But Dawan went into that bedroom, and he took Christian, moaning, groaning, took him in the other room. Now, we don't know what happened in there. We don't. But we know that the moaning stopped. He was taken back into bed, later wrapped up in a blanket, and walked out. That's what Lynn knows. That's what Lynn remembers. She told you on the stand that I don't think she processed that fully when she was an 8-year-old child, but looking back on it now, she believes he was gone at that point. And then you heard from Deshonda Linwood. When she was coming back from the bathroom, she saw the defendant carrying Christian, wrapped entirely in a blanket. She described it as somebody wearing a hoodie backwards, the face entirely covered up. No one wraps a sick child entirely in a blanket like that, covering their face, mouth, nose, especially not in the middle of June here in St. Louis. No, he wrapped Christian in that manner because Christian was dead at that point. And he left the house, and he was never seen again. So let's talk about that 911 call. The defendant's version of what happened is bogus. And that has been proven to you. Absolutely. The 1999 Ford Expedition, according to Dawan, was last seen driving eastbound into the city of St. Louis around 6:07 a.m. Well, you heard that the sun rose that day at 5:36. And you heard from Andrea Murphy Johnson and Mark Ellis, two people who don't even know each other. One of them doesn't even live in the state anymore, and neither of them know the defendant. And both of them saw that car on their street around twilight. She said around 5:15, and that would make sense. If sunrise at around 5:36, I believe twilight would be around 5:04, 5:15, leading into that time period. They all were very descriptive. It wasn't entirely dark, but it wasn't entirely light out yet. It was that in-between time period. The defense tried to poke holes in a lot of things. They were not able to poke a hole in that story at all. You can't change or poke a hole in the time the sun rises, and you can't poke a hole in two independent witnesses who have nothing to do with this case saying they saw that car there at 5:15. Almost an hour before the defendant made that 911 call. Now, yes, you heard yesterday from Dion Dupree. I don't think we need to say another word about Dion Dupree. His testimony was a joke. Look at the instructions. Look at what you can consider when assessing a witness's credibility. Look at Dion Dupree versus Mark Ellis and Andrea Murphy Johnson, and you tell me which story is more believable. But that's not it. We also have the whole issue with Lakeisha Mays and her car. If you look at that map, and I know it's hard to see on here, so let's go. Here is that little street Rombar. And here is that street Disco Drive. You heard from Andrea Murphy Johnson. She saw another car speeding away at the top of the street. She can't tell you what it was, what kind of car it was, but she knew that the expedition was on the street. Well, Lakeisha Mays lived half a mile from Rombar on Disco, and her car was already seen at the intersection of Page and Hodemont, right by that payphone, by Fox 2 news footage at 7:48. According to Lakeisha Mays, the defendant himself borrowed her car and got a ride somehow, some way. We don't know how. We don't know why. But we know it's false because the defendant was with the police from 6:07 for the next several hours. So he could not have gone up to Disco Drive and gotten that Malibu and then driven it to that intersection. It's not possible. You heard evidence that there were bags of Lakeisha's clothing found in the Malibu. Those bags of clothing were left at Dawan Ferguson's house. They were not in her car the night before, but they were in her car the next day. He put them there. He left them there, probably hoping no one ever would make the connection to a random car being parked on a street. Thank God the police did. And also found in her car that she had never seen before was a large black flashlight, like a police officer's, also like a bounty hunter's. The defendant's 911 call is ridiculous, and therefore Christian Ferguson was never missing. The defendant, acting with others, concealed the body. Now, Christian Ferguson has never been found. But we talked about this in jury selection, and there is no requirement, no element where a body is needed. So let's talk a little bit about what I do have to prove. These are all the jury instructions that the court just read to you. You will get a copy of these when you go back to deliberate. So you don't have to worry about writing it down. You can see it back there. This deals with the issue of acting with other people, okay? Because there were several people potentially involved here. What your goal is to decide the defendant's responsibility. Here it says, a person is responsible for his own conduct, and he is also responsible for the conduct of other persons in committing an offense if he acts with the other person with the common purpose of committing that offense, or if, for the purpose of committing that offense, he aids or encourages the other person in committing it. That instruction applies to all of the then 3 verdict directors you will get, okay? So when you see acting with others, that's what it refers to, and it means the defendant is still responsible.
Does anyone have objections to the statement of the law?
I like this approach.
All right, there was an objection. It was very hard to hear, so not sure what the basis was. I heard His Honor say, approach, please. And so the attorneys are talking this out at sidebar outside of the jury's hearing. Let me bring in my guest, criminal defense attorney and former prosecutor Marcia Minot. She's joining us from Atlanta, Georgia. She also hosts the Diva Court podcast. Marcia, great to have you today. What do you think so far of the state's closing argument, please?
So far, the state's doing a good job. They're systematically laying out their facts to present their evidence to the court.
Do you think they have enough evidence to prove the first-degree murder charge beyond a reasonable doubt?
I do not. Because they don't have any time of death, any cause of death, any manner of death, those things are missing from this case. You don't need a body in order to get a conviction on murder, but because they're missing those pieces, I do not believe they have enough for that murder.
Marcia Minot, appreciate it. Let's listen in as the state continues.
Like I said, that instruction applies to all of the verdict directors, okay? Here's the verdict director. And do you remember when we talked about, in jury selection, the elements and the things that I had to prove? We talked about it for probably too long, but it's important. So here's why. For count 1, this is murder in the first degree. The first element is that honor between January 16th, 2001 and June 18th of 2003. It's a wide range, but it encompasses everything that we have talked about, and that is why we are discussing that time period. And there's been no dispute at all with regard to the time period. In the county of St. Louis, state of Missouri, the defendant lived at Sylvan Place in Pine Lawn in St. Louis County. Again, no one is disputing that at all. The defendant, acting with others, caused the death of Christian Ferguson. The defendant had sole legal and physical custody of Christian Ferguson. He was the one responsible for taking care of him. He is the one that was responsible for getting his medication, his food, cleaning him, taking care of him, and he never did it. Well, he didn't do it nearly as much as he should have. You heard from the pharmacist. I don't know if you remember that striking number that she gave. The prescriptions that were ordered during that 2.5-year period would have been enough for about 300 and some odd days. But it was 4 a 580-day time period. Think about that. The life-sustaining medications for Christian Ferguson, his father only got him enough medication for about 300 plus days. And he expected that to last for 580. He caused Christian to lose weight, caused his ammonia levels to constantly be elevated, didn't care for him, brought him to the brink of death, and then that night he took him out and he killed him. It was the defendant that caused Christian's death. Second, that the defendant knew or was aware that his conduct was causing or was practically certain to cause the death of Christian Ferguson. Of course he knew. Of course he was aware that not giving his child the life-sustaining medication, not feeding him, it was practically certain to cause his death. He knew the risks. You heard from all the medical providers that talked about how he was educated on what to look out for, on what to give him, and why it was important. He didn't do it, and he knew of the risk. The risk was Christian would die, and Christian did. And third, that the defendant did so after deliberation, which means cool reflection upon the matter for any length of time, no matter how brief. So let's talk about deliberation. Oftentimes, people think deliberation means you have to have this incredibly well thought out plan where you organize something, you do it, it's done. No. Deliberation comes from the word deliberate, a deliberate act. It is a cool reflection upon the matter, no matter how brief. No matter how brief. But actually, in this case, we have years of deliberation. Every time he didn't give him his medication, every time he didn't bother to feed him, he knew what he was doing, and he didn't do it. That is a deliberate choice he made because Christian was an inconvenience he didn't want to be bothered with. Every time he saw the warning signs of a hyperammonemic state and delayed bringing him in, that was a deliberate choice by the defendant. And then that night, going into his room, that was a deliberate choice. Picking him up from his bed and taking him into the other room, that was a deliberate choice. And whatever struggle occurred in there, whatever he did to little Christian, that was absolutely a deliberate choice. And then he took him from the residence, did something with the body, and then planned a cover-up. We have met the element of deliberation. And that's it. The next line is quite clear. Then you will find the defendant guilty under count 1 of murder in the first degree. 3 elements. That's all I have to prove, and it has been proven to you. It's not, Your Honor.
Hold on a second. The objection's overruled. You may continue.
Okay, so the objection on the floor is misstatement of the law. We're going to hit the pause button here. And make no mistake about it, we're going to get you back in there without missing a thing in just a moment. Have to hit a quick break. This is Court TV Live, your front row seat to justice.
Go to pumpkin.care.
Welcome back to Court TV Live. I'm Julie Grant. So we're watching the closing arguments playing out in the missing son murder trial. This one's happening in St. Louis, Missouri. The defendant on trial is being accused of murdering his son, Christian. We're in the state's arguments right now. If you're just now joining us, we thank you for that. And if you've been watching along, tweet us right now. @Court TV is the Twitter handle. Let us know what you think of the state's closing arguments. Are they meeting their burden of proof? Remember, state's got the burden. The defense doesn't have one. Where we left off, defense counsel made an objection saying that the prosecutor was misstating the law. Let's go back in together now and watch.
Murder in the second degree, I don't think we need to focus on it too much because it's the exact same as murder in the first, minus the third element of deliberation. Nothing else changed. Same dates, same time period. The defendant acting with others caused Christian Ferguson's death, and that he knew or was aware that it was practically certain to happen. That's it. Then you will find him guilty of murder second. But you only get to murder in the second degree if you do not find him guilty of murder in the first degree. Everyone understand that? So you start out with murder in the first degree. You read through the elements, and if for some reason you do not find him guilty of that, then you must look at murder second. Okay? And then we have instruction number 8. Now this one reads, if you do not find him guilty of murder first or murder in the second degree, you must consider whether he is guilty of abuse of a child. Now there's more elements on here, so let's talk through them. The first one, same date, time range, location, again, none of that's disputed at all. That the defendant acting with others failed to provide Christian Ferguson with necessary nutrition and medication. You've heard from the doctors, you've seen the medical records, you've seen the pharmacist. He absolutely was failing to provide Christian Ferguson with his necessary life-sustaining medication. You saw that chart, 30-day supplies. That's all it was supposed to last for. And Melissa Heim described they were extended through 42 days, 70 days, 80 some odd days, 120 days. One of them, I believe, was 141 days. That proves that Christian Ferguson was not receiving the necessary medication that he needed to survive. These were not drugs you could just pick up at a local pharmacy. That's not how this went. And it got so bad where he hadn't been seen from a doctor in almost a year that they wouldn't even refill the prescription without seeing Christian. And even then, the defendant didn't even bother to go. The nurse brought him. It is crystal clear that Dawan Ferguson was failing to provide Christian Ferguson with necessary medication. The first element has been made. And second, that in doing so, the defendant inflicted cruel and inhuman punishment upon Christian Ferguson. This child's life was punishment. What he had to endure and suffer was cruel and it was inhumane. The food and nutrition alone was starving him. He was losing weight. He wasn't growing. He was eating his own diapers. Now I imagine the defense might point to the disease pica, but you heard actually from the experts who say that he would put things in his mouth, but he wouldn't actually eat them. But he was eating his diapers, because that's evidenced by what was found in his diapers. Only diapers, digested diapers, no food, no other fecal matter. That is cruel and inhuman punishment, coupled with the fact that he was left in his own soiled diapers, left in his own soiled bed, strapped to that bed, left in a room for hours, no supervision, no one checking on him. All of that is cruel and inhuman punishment. And third, that Christian Ferguson was then less than 17 years old. Again, that is not disputed at all. He was 9 years old at the time. Fourth, that the defendant knew his conduct was inflicting cruel and inhuman punishment upon a child less than 17. Of course he knew. He knew and he didn't care. He locked him away in that room and pretended like he didn't even have him. Wanted to go out to dinners, wanted to have his life, wanted to work. Got away with it when he had the nurses there at least. But from March forward, it was all on him, and he couldn't be bothered to care for that special needs kid. And that is terrible. And fifth, that Christian Ferguson died as a result of injuries sustained from this conduct. Like I said earlier, Christian Ferguson was put to the brink of death because of the defendants failing to provide him with all of this proper medication and nutrition. That's what got him to the brink of death when the defendant killed him. He is absolutely guilty of child abuse. Again, the next line reads, "Then you will find him guilty of it." Now again, like we discussed in jury selection, you must find and believe each and every element. If you don't, then you must find him not guilty. But that's not the case here. The defendant is guilty of murder in the first degree. He's guilty of child abuse resulting in death. But let's make this very clear. You can only find him guilty of one. So you start with murder first. If you don't find him murder first, then you move to murder second. And if you don't find him guilty of either murder first or murder second, then you move to child abuse. But make no mistake, Dawan Ferguson killed Christian after deliberation, and he is guilty of murder in the first degree. I said earlier that no one would ever want to believe that a person could be capable of this, much less a father. And we also talked about how the system failed Christian. He was a little boy. His life mattered. The people that surrounded him sucked. And his death has gone without any justice for 19 years. You heard from the witnesses. Dawan Ferguson was arrogant. I have a rich stepfather who can get me out of anything. And it worked. You heard about his criminal defense lawyer who went into the house on Sylvan 9 days after Christian was reported missing by the defendant. And you know the only thing they took? The medications. What does that tell you? They brought in Christian's sister the day before he was supposed to be returned to his mother, in the presence of the defendant's mother, in the presence of his defense lawyer, and they questioned him.
2 minutes.
Thank you.
We're hitting pause there at the 2-minute mark. The judge has set a time limit on these closing arguments to 1 hour and 15 minutes for each side. What that little child endured is absolutely unthinkable. We'll be right back with more Court TV Live and the closing arguments in the missing son murder trial after this.
Now,
Yes.
Welcome back to Court TV Live. I'm Julie Grant. Let's get you back into the courtroom now for more of the closing arguments in the missing son murder trial. The prosecutor just got the 2-minute warning from the judge. Let's hear the end, and then we'll hear from the defense.
Dawan Ferguson has gotten away with this for too long. So many people failed Christian. Don't you fail him too. The defense attorney is going to get up here, and she's going to make her closing argument now. There have been a lot of distractions throughout this whole case. Like I said earlier, the statements of lawyers, the arguments of lawyers, the questions and objections by lawyers are not evidence. Focus on the evidence. The overwhelming evidence of neglect. The evidence that proves he killed him. The things that have not been disputed. Focus on all of that. But when she's done, I will have an opportunity to talk to you again. And at that point, I will ask you to find the defendant guilty of murder. Thank you.